Yes, I had already set the date. It would be today. Have you ever heard anyone say that like that? With such certainty? As if the end were just another task marked on the calendar. As if there were nothing between now and never again. That was exactly the phrase that came out of my mouth that morning. And it wasn't on impulse. It was the end of a war no one saw coming. Because when a soldier returns home, what many forget is that he may have survived the bombs, but not his own thoughts. This is a true story. The story of a man who survived the battlefield but barely survived the silence. I returned from the war with all my limbs intact, but with my soul in pieces. It wasn't easy to explain what I felt, because I didn't even understand it. On the outside, I smiled. He replied, "It's okay," with that same automatic expression. But inside, it was as if something was slowly unraveling. An emptiness that wouldn't go away. A pain no one saw. Invisible scars of war. And maybe you felt that way too. Lost, disconnected, like the world was spinning too fast and you just wanted to get off. Maybe it wasn't a war in the literal sense. But who said pain needs a uniform to be real? Have you ever been through this? Those days when life seems too heavy? When the bed becomes a shelter and the daylight seems too aggressive to face? Stay with me until the end. Because what you're about to discover now may surprise you, and maybe even save you. That night, I was determined. I had written a letter. I had chosen a place. I knew exactly how it would all end. It wasn't despair. It was exhaustion. A silent struggle waged every night between the ghosts of the past and the absence of peace in the present. And worst of all, I didn't want anyone to know, because deep down shame was also armor. After all, how could someone who survived such a brutal war be about to fall into their own mind? Maybe that's why so many stories like mine are never told, because soldiers don't cry, men don't break down, and those who return from war have to be strong. But the truth is different. Sometimes the hardest war is precisely the one that happens when everything seems to be over. And in this war, there are no shots, only silence. There are no bombs, only memories. There is no blood, only hidden tears. But that day something happened, something I hadn't expected. A detail, a presence, a divine intervention. Call it what you will. I was ready for the end. But God arrived first, and no, it wasn't thunder, nor a voice from the sky. It was something simple, subtle, almost imperceptible, but absolutely impossible to ignore. And that's when everything starts to change. When we realize that even in our darkest moment, someone was already there before us. Someone who didn't give up. Even when we had already given up on everything. Someone who knows the pain without us needing to explain it. And what happened next? Well, that's what you're going to find out now. In that moment, when everything seemed sealed, when even hope had already packed its bags, that's when I felt it. I can't explain it exactly. I didn't see lights in the sky. I didn't hear any audible voices. But something inside me broke, or maybe it opened. A memory, a feeling, a warmth that didn't come from outside. It was as if God had whispered ever so softly, just as I was about to give up, "Not yet, I'm here." And maybe, just maybe, you who are listening to me now have felt something similar, or are feeling it. And if this topic touches you in some way, if this story speaks to a pain you carry inside, I really want to hear from you. In truth, leave a comment below with your thoughts on what touched you most, or even something you wish you'd heard when you were at rock bottom. Sometimes a sentence you write might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And here, we're not alone. We're a community. Oh, and if you felt this content is valuable, that these words need to continue reaching those living a silent war, like this video, it makes all the difference. YouTube understands this message is important and shares it with more people. And if you want to join us, subscribe to the channel, because every week I bring you real stories of pain and overcoming, of faith and new beginnings, stories that show that even in the dark, there is still light. Your participation here is what makes this space exist, what connects us, what sustains this purpose of speaking about what almost no one else does, with truth, compassion, and courage. And returning to that moment, something inside me changed. It wasn't all at once, but it was there, in that pause between the end and life, that a new path began to emerge. When my feet touched the ground at home for the first time after months of combat, there was an unspoken expectation in the air. Now everything would return to normal. The plane landed, the hugs came, eyes filled with tears, but I felt on a different wavelength. as if everyone else was listening to loud, upbeat music, and I was locked in a room, hearing only the muffled sound of my own breathing. Coming back from war seemed to those on the outside looking in like the end of one nightmare, but to me, it was the beginning of another. People expect soldiers to return as heroes, to smile, to start over, to be grateful for being alive, but no one talks about the inner workings of the mind of those who returned whole on the outside, but destroyed on the inside. I would wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, without understanding why. The sound of a car speeding down the street could transport me back to the desert, as if a piece of the war had hidden itself inside me. The war had ended outside, but it continued to live in my head, every day, silently, and perhaps the hardest part wasn't what I felt, but what others expected me to feel. You're okay now, right? That was the question that hurt the most. Because how was I going to explain that I no longer knew who I was? That I'd left a version of myself buried somewhere in the past and returned in a stranger's body? It was like living in a mask of someone who survived, while deep inside I wondered, am I still me? This disconnection was like walking into a familiar place, and at the same time, feeling that everything was foreign. The bed was the same, the smells of the house were the same, even breakfast tasted the same as before. But nothing touched me anymore. I ate without tasting, smiled without feeling joy, answered questions without hearing them. It was as if I had been disconnected from within, as if someone had turned off the lights, and I was merely imitating the gestures of someone alive. And the worst part was that no one noticed, because on the outside I was still the same soldier as before. No scars on my face, no amputated limbs, no obvious signs that anything was wrong. And therein lies the hidden truth. The worst wounds leave no visible marks. They hide behind short answers, low glances, long silences. They camouflage themselves in routine, in work, in forced jokes. And that's why so many people suffer in silence, because they don't seem to have the right to scream when there's no blood flowing. During this time, all I did was function. I got up, got dressed, did chores, but inside, I was just a burden. Every step felt like an effort. Every day felt like an endurance test. Memories didn't come as complete movies, they came as flashes. A smell, a sound, an image, and that was enough to throw me back into the chaos. It was like living in two realities at once, the external one, where everything seemed fine, and the internal one, where everything was still in ruins. People think a soldier's pain ends when he returns, but the truth is his return is just the beginning of a new war, the war against meaninglessness, against existential emptiness, against the silence that echoes louder than any explosion. Because back on the battlefield, strange as it may seem, there was a kind of purpose. The mission was clear: survive, protect, follow orders. Here, however, everything seemed blurred. What was my role now? Where did I fit in? And this, little by little, shapes my mind. The constant feeling of not belonging, of being a misfit in every environment, even among friends, even among family. Even the hugs I received seemed to fall short. I smiled out of politeness, but deep inside, every smile was a cruel reminder that I wasn't the same anymore, and perhaps never would be again. And when this idea begins to take root, it pushes you into a dark place, a place where you begin to think it would be better to disappear. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it was in this scenario of silent darkness that something began to move. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift, but one that gradually altered the way I saw myself and what I had experienced. And it was there, in the midst of this internal minefield, that true transformation began to show signs. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but it was real. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. If this story touches you in any way, please share it in the comments. If any part of this journey resonated with you, please share it in the comments. Sometimes, the simple act of writing can be the first step toward understanding what's still hidden. On the outside, everything seemed to be in place. I responded to messages, showed up for appointments, made jokes when a smile was expected. I performed the rituals of normality with almost rehearsed precision. But inside, it was as if I were on the verge of a silent collapse. A dark place no one saw, because it didn't leave marks on the skin, only on the soul. And the scariest thing was precisely that, appearing well enough that no one would ask if I really was. Waking up in the middle of the night was routine, not by choice, but because my sleep was interrupted by images that surfaced as if they had a life of their own. They weren't vivid memories, but sensations that returned with a vengeance. The dry crack of a gunshot, the metallic smell of blood, the scream that gave no time for an answer. No matter where I was or who I was with, all it took was a crack, a louder sound, a random smell, and my body reacted as if it were still at war. It was an emotional battlefield, where I fought against the past with weapons I didn't know how to wield. My mind became a constant source of stress, and everything began to weigh me down. Simple, everyday tasks seemed to require strength I didn't have. Taking a shower, eating, answering a phone call, every little thing became a giant obstacle. The feeling of being broken inside didn't come with an instruction manual, and because I didn't understand what was happening to me, I began to isolate myself. How can you explain to someone that you feel such an emptiness that it physically hurts, if you don't even know where it comes from? People continued living, moving forward. Friends were getting married, changing jobs, celebrating victories. And me? I found myself standing in the same place as if time had frozen for me. It was like being in a fishbowl, watching life pass by on the other side of the glass, but unable to reach it. And this generated an absurd guilt. Because I was alive, so many people didn't come back, and I was here, breathing. But this awareness, far from comforting me, only sank me deeper. Why me? Why did I come back if I can't even live with what I saw? This silent guilt is a hidden truth in the lives of many veterans. The feeling that you owe something to those who stayed behind, that you need to honor every step for those who can no longer take any. But instead of inspiring, this thought paralyzed me, as if I carried on my shoulders the names of everyone who never returned. And this became an almost unbearable weight, a kind of grief that knew no end, because it wasn't for just one person. It was for everyone, and for me too. And when the pain has no outlet, it builds. It turns into silence, into withdrawal, into a slow withdrawal. I started avoiding meetings, not answering calls, disappearing from social media. It was as if isolation was the only place where I still had control. There, no one held me accountable. No one praised me. No one expected anything from me. I could simply be nothing. And this nothing seemed more bearable than the pressure of appearing whole when I was falling apart inside. There were days when I'd stare at the ceiling for hours, thinking of nothing and yet thinking of everything at the same time, wondering where I'd lost myself, trying to understand when the man who'd returned stopped being the same man who'd left. And the more I tried to find that answer, the more distant I felt from myself. It was like living with a stranger inside my own body, a stranger who remembered my name but no longer felt the same way. Insomnia became a faithful companion, and in the late nights I relived moments I didn't want to remember. The voices, the screams, the decisions I had to make. Each flashback felt like a fragment of a puzzle that never quite completed, only leaving bigger holes. And over time I began to avoid even sleeping because sleep wasn't rest, it was a threat. The pillow, once synonymous with comfort, became the most vulnerable place in my life, because that was where the ghosts came to visit me. The mind, at this stage, ceases to be a refuge. It becomes a field of constant judgment, and with each new day, I felt like I was being watched, pressured, punished for something I couldn't define. I felt weak, useless, disconnected from my own existence. And yet, I kept pretending. Because life demands functionality. No one teaches you to say, I need help when you're trained to endure, to resist, to not show weakness. This self-sufficient mentality slowly kills us. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it was in this abyss that a small spark began to emerge, something that didn't come from outside, but also didn't seem to come from within, a kind of faded memory, an ancient voice, something that told me there was still a chance to truly live again, and I needed to confront the lies I'd told myself, that I didn't deserve to start over, that it was too late, that nothing would change. It was there that a new journey began, not of war, but of reconstruction. Comment here. That makes sense to me, if any part of this story resonated with how you feel or have experienced. Sometimes putting it into words is the first step to lifting the weight of the invisible. That night, everything seemed to finally fall into place, not in the sense of relief, but of surrender. The decision wasn't sudden. It had been growing silently, fueled by months of exhaustion, sleepless nights, fake smiles, and an emptiness that took up too much space inside me. It wasn't an impulse. It was what, in my mind, seemed the only logical path, a closure, A full stop where commas no longer fit. There was no fear. There was just weariness. A kind of exhaustion that can't be cured with rest. It was a weariness of the soul. I grabbed paper and pen. Yes, even living in digital times, something inside me wanted to write by hand, as if this were my last attempt to truly exist, to leave something that was mine. I had no plans to send that letter to anyone, but I felt I needed to speak to the world one last time, even if no one would listen. The words came out calmly, as if they had been ready for a long time, just waiting for the right moment to be put on paper. I'm sorry I couldn't carry on. It's no one's fault. The war consumed me inside, even after I returned. That was one of the sentences I wrote. I remember it clearly because that's exactly how I felt, as if there was a chasm between what was expected of me and who I really was. The letter wasn't a cry for help. It was a silent goodbye, a discreet ending to a story that for me had already lost its meaning. As I wrote, there was a strange sense of peace, not because it was right, but because I believed the pain would finally end. I no longer cried. There were no tears, just a cold tranquility, as if I were watching everything from the outside, like a spectator of my own life. And it was in this artificial calm that the plan began to form in detail. Location, time, what I would leave behind. Nothing grand, no dramatic scene, just the end of a fight I believed was already lost. The hardest part was thinking about who would find my body. That image gnawed at me, even in the midst of my apathy. I thought of my parents, my brother, my friends who might wonder what they could have done differently. And yet, within the twisted logic of my grief, I believed they would be better off later. That, in time, they would understand. That the absence of my suffering would ease the weight of my silent presence. The wounded mind creates absurd justifications, but in that moment, they seem perfectly reasonable. I remember the last thing I did before closing the letter. It was put on a song, one I used to listen to before the war when there were still dreams and plans. Somehow, I wanted that sound to connect me with a version of myself I no longer recognized. That's when something strange happened. A memory, a thought, an old simple scene. Me with my grandfather, still a child, hearing him say, "Even when all seems lost, wait a little longer." I don't know why that phrase came to me, but it did. And it echoed in my head, for a minute, 2, 10. It was as if a crack had opened in the very fabric of my certainty, as if a part of me deep down was still trying to breathe, still struggling, even if I didn't realize it. And that small, almost imperceptible fissure was enough to delay my plan, to make me hesitate. I began to pace the house. I looked at old photos. I opened a random drawer and found a letter I had written myself years before, at a time when I believed anything was possible. The letter was to myself. I had written it in a therapy session before the war. If you're reading this during a difficult time, remember everything you've overcome. You're still capable. I looked at that handwriting as if it belonged to someone else. Someone I no longer was, but at the same time, someone who might still be inside me. It was then that doubt began to take shape. Not a desperate doubt, but a curiosity. What if, just for today, I postponed the end? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happened in the following hours wasn't magical. There was no light from heaven, no audible voice, but there was something I didn't expect. A visit, a simple gesture, a sentence that penetrated the defenses I didn't even know I still had. And that's when everything began to change. Not from the outside in, but from the inside out. A slow process, full of setbacks, but absolutely real. Write it down. I understand this silence. If at any time you felt that the silent pain was speaking too loudly inside you, sometimes the first step to listening to yourself is to get it out. That night everything seemed to finally fall into place, not in the sense of relief, but of surrender. The decision wasn't sudden. It had been growing silently, fueled by months of exhaustion, sleepless nights, fake smiles, and an emptiness that took up too much space inside me. It wasn't an impulse. It was what, in my mind, seemed the only logical path. A closure, a full stop where commas no longer fit. There was no fear. There was just weariness. A kind of exhaustion that can't be cured with rest. It was a weariness of the soul. I grabbed paper and pen. Yes, even living in digital times, something inside me wanted to write by hand, as if this were my last attempt to truly exist, to leave something that was mine. I had no plans to send that letter to anyone, but I felt I needed to speak to the world one last time, even if no one would listen. The words came out calmly as if they had been ready for a long time, just waiting for the right moment to be put on paper. I'm sorry I couldn't carry on. It's no one's fault. The war consumed me inside even after I returned. That was one of the sentences I wrote. I remember it clearly because that's exactly how I felt, as if there was a chasm between what was expected of me and who I really was. The letter wasn't a cry for help. It was a silent goodbye, a discreet ending to a story that, for me, had already lost its meaning. As I wrote, there was a strange sense of peace, not because it was right, but because I believed the pain would finally end. I no longer cried. There were no tears, just a cold tranquility as if I were watching everything from the outside like a spectator of my own life, and it was in this artificial calm that the plan began to form in detail. Location, time, what I would leave behind. Nothing grand, no dramatic scene, just the end of a fight I believed was already lost. The hardest part was thinking about who would find my body. That image gnawed at me, even in the midst of my apathy. I thought of my parents, my brother, my friends who might wonder what they could have done differently, and yet, within the twisted logic of my grief, I believed they would be better off later. That in time, they would understand. That the absence of my suffering would ease the weight of my silent presence. The wounded mind creates absurd justifications, but in that moment, they seem perfectly reasonable. I remember the last thing I did before closing the letter. It was put on a song, one I used to listen to before the war when there were still dreams and plans. Somehow I wanted that sound to connect me with a version of myself I no longer recognized. That's when something strange happened. A memory, a thought, an old, simple scene. Me with my grandfather, still a child, hearing him say, "Even when all seems lost, wait a little longer." I don't know why that phrase came to me, but it did, and it echoed in my head. For a minute, 2, 10. It was as if a crack had opened in the very fabric of my certainty, as if a part of me deep down was still trying to breathe, still struggling, even if I didn't realize it, and that small, almost imperceptible fissure was enough to delay my plan, to make me hesitate. I began to pace the house. I looked at old photos. I opened a random drawer and found a letter I had written myself years before, at a time when I believed anything was possible. The letter was to myself. I had written it in a therapy session before the war. If you're reading this during a difficult time, remember everything you've overcome. You're still capable. I looked at that handwriting as if it belonged to someone else, someone I no longer was, but at the same time, someone who might still be inside me. It was then that doubt began to take shape. Not a desperate doubt, but a curiosity. What if, just for today, I postponed the end? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happened in the following hours wasn't magical. There was no light from heaven, no audible voice, but there was something I didn't expect. A visit, a simple gesture, a sentence that penetrated the defenses I didn't even know I still had. And that's when everything began to change, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. A slow process full of setbacks, but absolutely real. Write it down. I understand this silence. If at any time you felt that the silent pain was speaking too loudly inside you, sometimes the first step to listening to yourself is to get it out. The letter was already folded. The music had stopped. The room was plunged into an almost ceremonial silence. I was there, with everything resolved, every detail planned, every decision made. What else could happen? Nothing seemed to have more power over me. But then, the sound came. 3 sharp knocks, a pause, and 2 more. They weren't loud, they weren't urgent, but they were enough to break me out of my trance. Someone was knocking on my door, at that time of night. For a second I stood still. My heart raced, not out of fear, but out of a strangeness I couldn't explain. It was as if that sound had penetrated the wall of my indifference. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to talk to anyone. But there was something in that beat, as if it were saying, "You are still here." I got up almost automatically, and when I opened the door, it wasn't a friend, a neighbor, or someone I'd expected. It was the building's doorman. A simple man with a tired look. He held out a small envelope and said, "This arrived earlier today. I think they left it in the wrong place." I nodded my thanks, took the envelope, closed the door, and stood there staring at the paper, not understanding what was happening. It didn't make sense. I wasn't expecting anything. No mail, no package. But I opened it anyway. Inside was a sheet of paper, handwritten, simple, feminine writing. It began. I don't know if this letter will arrive in time, but I felt I needed to write to you. It was from the wife of a friend who served with me and had died during our last year of mission. She said that lately she had dreamed about me frequently, and that in one of those dreams she felt compelled to tell me, "You still have something to do here." I reread it 4 times. My mind couldn't process what was before me. It didn't make sense. It didn't know what I was going through. It had no idea where I was emotionally. And yet those words struck like a bolt of lightning into a structure about to crumble. It was as if someone had opened a window in a closed room years ago. The air shifted, and along with it something inside me began to stir. There was no immediate relief. It wasn't as if everything had suddenly been resolved, but that letter stirred something that was already cracked. It forced me to reevaluate the rigidity of my certainties. Perhaps I wasn't as convinced of the end as I thought. Perhaps there was still a space, however small, to consider the possibility of continuing, and that, in itself, was a miracle. I lay on the sofa with the letter in my hands. I stared at the ceiling, as if searching for an answer in the cracks. I didn't know if I believed in coincidences, but that felt like an intersection between 2 worlds, as if someone, somewhere, was seeing what I was trying to hide even from myself. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, I cried. Not a desperate cry, but a clean cry, a kind of release, as if each tear washed away some of the emotional debris I had accumulated for so long. It was only then that I realized how hardened I had become, how far I had distanced myself from any kind of sensitivity. I was living like a wall, cold, opaque, immobile, and that knock on the door, that envelope, those words, they were like cracks that let in light, a light I didn't even know still existed. Because the hidden truth is that pain doesn't just hurt us, it also convinces us that hope is a luxury we can no longer afford. And when we believe this, we begin to accept the darkness as part of who we are. But in that moment, with the letter on my chest, an idea emerged. What if I didn't need to go back to who I was? What if the journey wasn't about rebuilding the old, but about allowing a new version of myself to emerge from the rubble? That question reverberated in my mind. It forced me to look at my wounds not as failures but as marks of a journey, signs that even hurt, I was still moving. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a brutal difference between surviving and living, and I began to realize that my greatest enemy wasn't the past. It was the way I was relating to it, the stories I told myself, the decisions I made based on a pain I'd never allowed to heal. And it was at that point that something inside me began to reorganize, not as a plan, but as a new attitude toward life. Comment here. The knock on the door woke me up. If this story resonated with you in any way, sometimes what saves you isn't a great answer. It's just a reminder that you're still here. I remained there, the letter on my chest, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, a silent confusion forming within me. It was as if the pain had receded for a moment, just long enough for something new to approach, and that something came with no explanations, no logic. There were no words. There was a presence, something unseen, untouched, but felt, a sudden peace that made no sense considering everything I'd been carrying up to that point. As if in the midst of the darkness, someone had lit a candle, small, but stubborn enough not to go out. It wasn't just relief. It was as if an invisible force was silently telling me that I wasn't alone, and that this pain, this limit that I believed to be the end, wasn't all there yet. There was more. And as much as my mind tried to resist, something inside me had already surrendered, not to the end, but to the possibility that God, somehow, was there, present, attentive, and making himself felt at the very moment I thought no one else cared. It's strange to describe this feeling, because it didn't come with a spectacle. It didn't come with lights, or an opening sky, or angels around. It was something extremely subtle, almost shy, but at the same time, it was strong, warm, as if that silence that suffocated me had changed tone, as if it stopped being an endless void and transformed into a space where God sat with me, unhurried, unpressured, just there. And in that moment, for the first time I felt I could breathe again. Not that the pain had disappeared, but it was no longer absolute. It no longer took over everything. There was a crack in the despair, a gap in the darkness, and through that crack, hope began to creep in, slowly, like someone asking for permission, like someone who knows they need to be careful with someone who has already lost almost everything. The curious thing is that until then, I had avoided any conversation about faith. I listened, but didn't let it in. I thought it was beautiful to see others believe, but for me, it was as if the war had stripped away any possibility of God living within. But in that moment, something changed. It was as if he had reminded me that he never left. That even when I screamed in the dark, even when I said I couldn't take it anymore, even when I completely ignored him, he was there, silent, but not absent. And it touched me in places I didn't even know still existed, because it's one thing to survive events. It's quite another to survive what those events have wrought within you. And I was tired of carrying it all alone, of feigning strength when what I needed was rest. And that's when I realized, maybe I didn't need to fight the same way anymore. Maybe true courage now lay in allowing myself to be supported, admitting that I couldn't do it alone, and that was okay. His presence in that room wasn't something I understood with my mind. It was something my heart recognized before any explanation, as if a spiritual memory had lain dormant within me, and it had been awakened. It was a deep, intimate connection, as if I'd been called by name, as if someone were reminding me of my identity, my purpose, why I was still here, even when everything told me it was time to leave. And you know what's most impressive? It didn't happen because I asked for it. It didn't happen because I deserved it. It happened because he knew that if it hadn't happened that night, I wouldn't be here telling this story. And he didn't arrive with answers. He arrived with presence, with acceptance, with that lightness that only God can bring, even in the most difficult environments. And that's what broke me. That's what dismantled me, only to then begin to rebuild me. I was still far from well. There was still pain, confusion, fear, but now there was something more, a new kind of foundation emerging, something that, even fragile, was already supporting me in a different way. It wasn't about me trying to solve everything with my own hands anymore. It was about trusting that someone much bigger was already taking care of what I thought was impossible to heal. And that completely changed the way I began to look at my story. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a difference between believing in God and feeling God. And that night I felt it, and it was this feeling that began a journey that, to this day, continues to transform me from within. A journey where pain doesn't magically disappear but is gradually redefined, where the past isn't forgotten but is put in its rightful place, and where, above all, I no longer walk alone. Comment here. I felt that presence too. If at some point in your journey you too have experienced this kind of invisible touch, the one that cannot be explained, but changes everything. After that night, something inside me had changed. It wasn't like flipping a switch. It didn't happen overnight, but there was a new clarity, a feeling I hadn't known until then. I could still choose to continue, and perhaps that was the first major decision that saved my life, allowing the journey to not end there. Still afraid, still in pain, but now with a spark that wouldn't let me give up. Deep down, I knew I could no longer carry it all alone. The silence that once seemed to protect me now oppressed me, and breaking it was like taking a step toward freedom. The first thing I did was pick up my phone and send a message. Short, simple, but full of everything I could no longer hide. I wrote, "I need to talk." It was for a childhood friend, someone who knew me before the war, before everything fell apart. He didn't ask any questions, he just answered, "I'm here." That answer, so brief and direct, had a profound impact. Not because it offered solutions, but because it reminded me that there was someone willing to listen, and that, surprisingly, was already a lot. I started talking, slowly, little by little. At first I couldn't even put into words what I felt, but the more I talked, the more I understood. It was as if opening my mouth also opened the windows to my soul, and with each sentence spoken, a little of the weight lifted. I realized I had spent so long trying to hide the pain that it had become part of my identity, and breaking this cycle was the first step toward true transformation, because talking about what destroys us is often the only way to begin rebuilding. It wasn't long before I sought professional help, and here I need to say something that changed my mindset. Asking for help isn't weakness, it's courage. The courage to face what haunts us, to admit we don't have all the answers, to allow someone to go behind our scenes and see the mess the pain has left. In therapy, I discovered parts of myself that were dormant, hurt, hidden, and over time, I began to see that the war hadn't finished me. It had only made me forget who I was. Each session was a deep dive, sometimes light, sometimes difficult, but always necessary, because no one heals from what they refuse to face. And I had to face many things: the guilt, the fear, the traumas that haunted me even when everything seemed calm around me. The hidden truth is that pain doesn't disappear with time. It settles, disguises itself, changes form, and if we don't talk about it, it grows inside silently, until one day it takes over everything, and I no longer wanted to live suffocated. It was on this path that I rediscovered my faith, not a memorized faith, repeated out of habit, but a living, intimate faith built on the questions that once frightened me. For the first time I understood that God is not offended by our doubts, that He remains, even when we can't believe in anything, and it was this constant presence, even when silent, that began to give me the strength to carry on, not as a hero, not as someone who had overcome everything, but as someone who, even wounded, decided to keep walking. Life outside the war was no longer a field of fog and gradually became a realm of possibility. I began to appreciate the little things again. A hot cup of coffee in the morning, a long shower, the light streaming through the window. Moments that had previously gone unnoticed began to take on meaning, and this reconnected me with life, not with the ideal, perfect life, but with a real life, imperfect, but full of possibilities. And this reconnection showed me that starting over doesn't require huge leaps. Sometimes everything starts with a small but firm step. Talking about it saved my life, literally, because while I pretended everything was fine, I sank. But as I began to expose my wounds, the shame faded. Guilt gave way to responsibility, and isolation gave way to connection. I learned that I don't need to be whole to be worthy of love, that I don't need to have overcome everything to be accepted. And that vulnerability isn't a sign of weakness, but of humanity. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because there's an emotional trap many people silently face, believing they can only ask for help when they're in ruins, when, in fact, help is most effective when we're still broken, but willing to put the fragments back together, little by little. And this willingness is what changes everything. Comment here, I'm on this journey too. If you've ever felt that talking was the first step to starting to breathe again, sometimes just acknowledging this can help us start to come back to life. At some point in my journey, I realized that there was a new question haunting my days. And now, what do I do with everything I've experienced? Because it was no longer just about surviving or starting over in silence. It was about giving real meaning to everything that had hurt, marked, and changed me. The pain, which had previously paralyzed me, began to feel like a bridge. And if I had crossed that bridge, perhaps I could have reached out to those still halfway there. And so, almost without realizing it, a mission was born. Not one of those that involve grand movements or impactful speeches, but a mission made of presence, of listening, of shared truth. I began by talking to a single veteran in a coffee shop. Then I was invited to participate in a discussion group at a community center. And suddenly, without having planned anything, my story was being told. Not as an example of overcoming adversity, but as proof that carrying on is possible, even when all seemed lost. I didn't want to be a hero. I just wanted to be someone who said, I know how it is. Because there's immense power in hearing this when you're sinking. There's a quiet relief in knowing you're not alone in feeling all that. Group sessions became part of my routine, and every time I saw in another soldier's eyes the same pain that once lived within me, I understood that this new phase of my life wasn't a coincidence. It was a calling. It was about giving back, about transforming trauma into a path, and that's what changed everything. I learned that what once nearly destroyed me was now what connected me to others. I began visiting hospitals, clinics, and recovery centers. In some places, my presence was nothing more than a handshake and a firm gaze. In others, I told part of my story. And in all these spaces, something happened. Someone recognized themselves. Someone allowed themselves to speak. And there, in that first thread of a voice, a possibility of a new beginning was born. This impact taught me that it's not always necessary to understand everything to be useful. Sometimes transformation happens precisely when we decide to make ourselves available, even without having all the answers. The hidden truth is that pain, when navigated, becomes a tool, and that's exactly what I experienced. Using my pain as an instrument of acceptance, not to erase what I experienced, but to give it greater meaning, something that went beyond me. Today, the war I fight is different. I no longer carry rifles, nor do I wear armor, but I'm still a soldier. A soldier who chose to fight against silence, against emotional abandonment, against the false idea that those who suffer must hide. I fight for other soldiers, not just those who wore uniforms, but also for those who live their own invisible battles. Because suffering doesn't choose uniforms. It disguises itself in faces that go unnoticed every day. Talking about my story became a commitment, because I know that sometimes it's a single sentence that decides someone to take another step. It's a look that rekindles hope. It's a simple testimony that gives courage a foothold. And this gave me back something I thought I'd lost: purpose. When I understood that what I'd experienced could serve to save lives, I realized mine had already been saved too. The mission now was different, but it was still a mission. Today, when I return to the places where I was broken inside, I take something new with me. I take listening. I take compassion. I take the certainty that even the most painful stories can become a bridge, and that bridge is built one conversation at a time, one sharing at a time, one new beginning at a time. Each person who finds meaning in their pain by listening to mine reminds me why I kept going. It reminds me that there is beauty even in what tore us apart, if we choose to transform the end into a seed. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because this mission to help others also revealed to me a truth that almost no one talks about. Caregivers also need care. Those who embrace others, who listen, who support, also need a hug, a break, support. And understanding this took me to a new level of awareness about my own journey. I was learning to care for myself while providing care, and this completely changed the way I walked. Comment here: I turned my pain into a mission. If you've already understood that what hurt you can also be what brings you closer to others. Sometimes it's in this connection that true healing begins. If you've made it this far and at some point felt touched by all this, then listen carefully to what I'm about to say, because perhaps no one has told you this with the clarity you deserve to hear. Your pain is real. It's not an exaggeration. It's not weakness. It's not drama. It exists. It pulsates. It weighs. And if there are days when you feel like no one cares, that no one notices what's going on inside, know that you are not alone. Even if the world seems oblivious, even if you've learned to smile on the outside while everything falls apart on the inside, your struggle matters. You matter. Sometimes what hurts the most isn't what happened to us, but the feeling that no one is watching. And then comes that screaming silence, that loneliness that fills every space in our soul. And in this emptiness, dangerous, distorted thoughts are born, making us believe nothing will change, that no one would notice if we disappeared, that maybe it would even be a relief. But I'm here to remind you of a truth that even when we forget, remains true. God sees what no one sees, and He arrives. Sometimes at the last moment, sometimes when everything seems over, but He arrives. I don't know where you are in your journey right now. Maybe you're at the height of exhaustion. Maybe you're at emotional rock bottom. Or maybe you're just beginning to realize there's something inside that needs tending. It doesn't matter. What matters is that there is hope, and it doesn't depend on your strength, your perfect faith, or your ability to understand everything. Hope is that thread that, even when everything seems to be falling apart, still holds you by the heart. Sometimes it comes in a gesture, a word, a presence that you can't see, but can feel, like an invisible embrace at the very moment you are about to lose yourself. And if you feel like you're no longer strong, that's okay. You don't have to carry this alone. You weren't even meant to. There are people and there's a God already on the path, just waiting for you to take a step, a small, honest step, a movement that says, I don't want to give up now. Because when you decide not to give up even without knowing how to continue, something powerful happens. Help appears. Faith is rekindled. Light shines through the cracks. And the impossible begins to show signs that it can indeed become possible. This internal war you feel may seem endless, but it has loopholes. It has exits. It has paths. And they aren't wide, bright, or obvious. Sometimes they're narrow, dark, and silent, but they're paths nonetheless. The secret isn't in having all the answers, but in continuing to walk even with doubts, even with fear, even with pain, because it's in movement, however slow, that transformation happens. And there's no such thing as useless pain. There's no such thing as wasted tears. There's a purpose being built even when everything seems meaningless. You are not weak for being tired. You are not less spiritual for feeling that your faith has wavered. You are not less worthy for not being well all the time. You are human, and your humanity is the space where God works most profoundly. Because He does not expect perfection, He responds to sincerity, to surrender, to the most honest cry for help that comes from the soul. And He doesn't come only when everything is fine. He draws near, especially when everything is about to break, when the pain is so great that his name comes out between tears and whispers, when you can barely speak, but still choose not to be silent before heaven. If no one has ever truly told you this, listen now. You are valuable. Your life has weight. It has meaning. What you carry is not light, but it is not eternal either, and there is a place of healing that still stands, waiting for you. You may not be able to see this place now, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It is there, on the other side of your resistance, ready to welcome you. And maybe this is the time to stop fighting alone, to lower your internal weapons, to allow grace, care, and hope to enter without asking permission. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a subtle lie many people believe without realizing it, that feeling pain is a sign that something is wrong with you. But what if it's just the opposite? What if pain is a sign that there's still something alive inside you, something that hasn't given up, something that still awaits healing, meaning redemption? That's what we'll continue to talk about. Comment here, that makes sense to me, if these words touched some corner of your heart that had been silent for too long. Sometimes, it's in that subtle touch that healing begins. When the pain seems greater than any words that can be spoken, we learn to live in silence. We learn to be silent when everything inside screams. We learn to feign stability when, inside, our soul trembles. But there's something I discovered along this journey, something that didn't come from a book, a lecture, or even an expected place. Shared pain lessens the weight. And more than that, the light that pierced my darkness can also illuminate the path of someone who is walking blindly now. That's why I decided not to keep this story to myself, because for a long time, what paralyzed me was precisely the feeling of being alone, of thinking that no one could understand, that my pain was too specific, too complex, too ugly to be shared. But then came the most human revelation of all. We are all, on some level, trying to find meaning, trying to make peace with the past, trying to survive the fall and, if possible, rise with something in our hands. And at that point, it doesn't matter where your war originated. What matters is what you do with the rubble it leaves. The hidden truth that almost no one has the courage to say is that sometimes a life is saved by a conversation, by a story told at the right moment, by a memory that returns in the midst of chaos. And that's exactly why I started speaking out. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that hiding pain feeds despair, but exposing the truth opens space for healing. And each time I shared a piece of what I experienced, someone on the other side recognized themselves. And each time someone said, "I felt that way too," a new bond was formed. Between survivors, between seekers, between those tired of feigning strength all the time. The light that reached me didn't come like a spotlight. It came like a chink, a detail, a gesture that could have gone unnoticed but which entered right where the darkness no longer made sense. And it was there that everything began to change. Because true change doesn't begin when life gets organized, but when we decide to look at ourselves with more compassion than judgment, when we stop demanding immediate healing and begin to respect the timing of our own hearts, when we understand that God doesn't work on podiums, but on the ground of our souls where almost no one looks. You who are listening to this right now may not know it, but perhaps you are that ray of light for someone. Maybe your pain, your process, your broken silence, your story told with sincerity is exactly what will stop someone from giving up. And not because you have all the answers, but precisely because you have the same questions. Because you know the weight, the emptiness, the fear. And that, in the real world, is worth more than any cliché. The impact born of empathy is always more lasting than the effect of hasty advice. So if this story touched you, hold this, dear. Nothing you've experienced is in vain. Not the dark days. Not the thoughts you were too embarrassed to share. Not the moments you thought about disappearing. All of this, if transformed with truth, can become a source of meaning. It can be your greatest tool for connection. Because when someone hears, "I've been there too," a bridge is born. And bridges, always lead someone to a better place. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because there is a decision that changes everything, and that goes far beyond the moment the pain ends. It is the choice to transform this received light into shared light. That is what we will continue to do. Comment here. Sharing is an act of healing. If you also believe that your story can be more than survival, it can be a seed of transformation. If you've made it this far, I can only say one thing. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this story. I know it wasn't easy, that there were parts that were difficult to hear, perhaps because deep down, Some of them speak directly to you. And if at any point in this video you felt something inside you move, then it was worth it, because it's not just about what I experienced, but about what we share when we choose not to walk alone. If this message resonated with you, if it embraced you in some silent way, leave a like, not for me, but for everything this conversation has built between us. It's the kind of small gesture that helps this space continue to exist. And if you want to continue this journey with us, subscribe to the channel. This is a place for welcoming stories, for questions that take their time, for new beginnings that don't need applause to be worthwhile. And if you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "I'm with you until the end." That way I'll know you were here, whole, present, even in silence, and that makes all the difference. There's a video right here that complements everything we talked about today. Click and stay with me there, because this journey I know still has much more to reveal.